Welcome to this Patient Voice Initiative webinar, Capturing the Value of Rare and Paediatric Treatments. It's a webinar especially for patient communities in Australia, but as always, you're all most welcome. I'm Anne Single from the Patient Voice Initiative, and I'm delighted to share that our chair, patient advocate Jessica Bean, is not here today because she's on leave caring for her beautiful baby girl. Some of you may know that I'm currently serving on the HTA Review Reference Committee. I just want to be clear that I'm not speaking or working in that capacity during this session. This is just a Patient Voice Initiative event. Before we start, can I acknowledge the Yagara and the Turrbal, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, and can I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and any elders who may be joining us today. So you may know that the Patient Voice Initiative aims to ensure that patients are seen, heard and valued in healthcare decision-making, especially health technology assessment. And health technology assessment is used by governments around the world to determine the value of new health interventions, often to decide if they are sufficiently good value for the government to subsidise their cost to patients. It relies on good evidence like randomised controlled trial data, economic analysis, but also deliberation or that informed discussion about what the evidence means for local patients and the health system. So in Australia, this is the process which guides decisions about what the Australian government funds on the Medicare benefits schedule and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. And just a reminder that health technologies are not necessarily really flash technologies. They're any health intervention. They could be something to diagnose a condition, like a blood test. They could be something to treat a condition, like a medicine, or something to prevent a condition, like a vaccine or exercise program. And essentially, health technology assessment, often called HTA, is a process whereby the evidence of benefit and cost is considered to see if the new intervention is cost effective or good value for money compared to the existing treatment or care. So if you haven't met us before, the Patient Voice Initiative is a not-for-profit. We receive sponsorship, and we'll share that slide so that you can see who our sponsors are. And we're very grateful to our sponsors, both those who give us financial support and those who give us in-kind support. We're led by a patient chair and we essentially do two things. Just excuse me while I move my admit button. Thank you. One of the things we do is we provide practical support to patient communities so that patient communities know how to use their expertise to get involved in HTAs in Australia. And we also provide forums like this so that we can talk about what HTA for and with patients might look like. So this session today is primarily drawing on international experience and work. And we're doing that so that we can gain some insights into experiences overseas of capturing and/or determining the value of treatments for rare and paediatric conditions. And it also will help us think about the implications for understanding patient perspectives of value more broadly. So whether your interest is rare or paediatrics or a completely different part, disease or condition, a completely different part of the health system, we hope that there's something in this session that will give you some insights into the value of patient knowledge and gathering evidence that captures what matters most to patients. So today I'm joined by three guests. Initially, I'm going to focus on our guests from overseas before bringing in some homegrown knowledge and experience. And as we chat, please add your questions to the chat box. And I'd also love it, Karen Facey had this idea earlier, one of our speakers, I'd love it if you'd add the things that you think will be your key takeaways from this session, because we'd love to write that up so that we can take forward those discussions. And we love it also when you tag to say where you are on your IG. We will try and answer all questions, but as always, we will prioritise the questions from the patient community. So our first guest is Dr. Karen Facey, And Karen established health technology and assessment in Scotland more than 20 years ago. And that's where I had the pleasure to work for her. Since then, she's set up another HTA body in Wales, and she's a driving force behind patient involvement. She founded the HTA International Interest Group for Patient and Citizen Involvement, and she's the lead editor of the only academic book in the area. But Karen, that is just the tip of the iceberg. I'd love you to share a little more about who you are, your career, how you came to be involved in the area we're talking about tonight.
Thanks so much, Anne, and to everybody for on the call tonight. It's just a great pleasure to be with you. So actually, I'm a statistician by training. I've worked in big pharma and in medicines regulation in the UK. And as you said, 23 years ago, I went to Scotland to set up the first national HTA body. And it was great to work with you there, Anne. We started you in a role which was about communication, and actually soon identified that we needed more than communication. We needed patient involvement. So you helped lead that patient involvement work, which was wide and varied. And our work was really led by what was happening in Scandinavia. I knew nothing about health technology assessment when I went to Scotland, and I went to the Danish Winter School for Health Technology Assessment, and incredibly lucky I feel, because they said to me that the value of a medicine or an intervention is not just about clinical and cost effectiveness. It depends on how it's organized, particularly important for perhaps surgical interventions and educational interventions, but also about patient issues. And they took this very seriously, that they invested in research to understand patient experiences. They engaged with social anthropologists who actually followed patients for a year to get in-depth and rich information about what it was really like to live with a condition and the experiences that patients had in terms of taking new medicines or new interventions. And that really influenced the way we work, I think. So we took that learning back to Scotland, and we invested in academic research to understand patient experiences. The government at the time, back in 2001, also told us we needed to engage with patients in our decision making. So we reached out to growing patient organizations, and we included them in our expert groups, and that we found very beneficial, so we continued that process. In terms of the rare disease aspect, about 15 years ago, I was asked to think about particular issues with rare diseases, because there are small numbers of patients available for study. And as a statistician, people thought I would be interested in this. But once I got involved in the field of rare diseases, I realized that it was more than small numbers that cause the challenges. It's the heterogeneity of the disease, the way in which it varies in different patients, the incredible burdens of a rare disease, which often occur in children. We know that 80% have childhood onset, and the genetic implications of how this affects the whole family. So I was sparked an interest in rare diseases then, and that's developed over the past 15 years. And I'll tell you more about that after Fleur's been introduced.
Thank you, Karen. You've had such a diverse career, and I think, you know, we're the first person who made me think, I really wish I knew more about statistics, because it takes you in so many different ways to try and understand what is the basis of this claim, you know, and it's fantastic to have you join us tonight. So as Karen said, our other UK guest is Fleur Chandler, and Fleur is a health economist, and she's got more than 30 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry, initially working in clinical trials across a range of therapeutic areas, including HIV, respiratory and rare diseases in both adults and children. And Fleur now heads market access at Sanofi UK and Ireland. But Fleur also leads a global collaborative initiative creating a disease-level evidence base for HTA in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Fleur, what led you to the work we're talking about tonight? And welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's lovely to have such a warm welcome. Well, as you can see from the disclosures, one of the reasons that plunged me into the world of rare diseases was when my son was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He was age 3, that was back in 2009. So I've been a rare disease parent for the last 13 years. And all of the thing that entails, including being in a clinical trial. So I think what that's really what's plunged me into this, but it's one of these places where both your professional and personal worlds collide. And I've got such a wealth of experience in health technology assessment and evidence gathering that I really wanted to pull that together and explore how we could support initially Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but then also like how that would apply to other rare conditions, particularly in the paediatric space. So I'm speaking right today.
That was terrific, Fleur. I just couldn't get my microphone to turn back on. So thank you. Sorry to leave that pause there. It's wonderful to have you with us, Fleur. And can I introduce our local guest, Nicole Millis. Many of you will know Nicole. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Rare Voices Australia, and that's a role in which she guided the collaborative development of the National Strategic Action Plan for Rare Diseases. And that's Australia's first nationally coordinated effort to address rare diseases. Nicole has held also the role of consumer nominee on the Life-Saving Drugs Program expert panel since 2018. Welcome, Nicole. Nicole, your background is social work. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to lead this work in rare disease advocacy?
Sure, thanks, Anne, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to see a lot of friendly faces on the webinar. So yeah, my professional background is social work, but I guess my story perhaps is a little bit similar to Fleur's in that I also am a rare disease mum. So that's how I became part of the rare disease community in 2001. And indeed, even my first, I guess, rare disease advocacy was in HTA. It was because I knew there was a treatment for my son available overseas, but wasn't available in Australia, and really had no understanding of why that was. And I think for me that, I think sometimes in rare disease, we often have to find our own ways. And while I wasn't quite sure what to do, I was pretty sure I wouldn't make things worse. So that was sort of the attitude that spun me forward. And I asked lots of questions, and I learnt as I went along. But that was I guess my first, I learned about all those wonderful acronyms that really don't make any sense until you have to decipher them. So in Australia, we have PBAC, we have LSDP, the Life-Saving Drugs Program, and I think it's quite strange. So now I'm the consumer nominee on the expert panel, but I feel like I almost know every part of that program. So that program, my son is a patient of, so I've seen it from that perspective. Also, with my work with Rare Voices Australia, we advocated for reform to that program, so I've seen that side of it, and so it's actually been personally quite fulfilling to now be on, I guess, the department side of it, or the other side of it, and really have an understanding. Really have an understanding of that. So I guess similarly to Fleur, eventually my personal and professional life collided, and I discovered I really liked policy and processes, so that hopefully that people don't need to do those individual journeys, or we don't know where we're going, but we head off anyway, because we'll catch more, the processes will be strong enough to capture all that. So that's my hope, and why I'm still doing what I'm doing.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. And yes, I mean, I think not long ago we were thinking about all the patient advocates and all the people in patient communities who had formed their groups, even since, some of the earlier reviews in this area, and, the national medicine policy, and the enormous influence you've had on our landscape here. So it's great to have you on this discussion today. I'm going to start off by going back to you, Karen. I'm really keen to hear about one of the projects you've worked on, the one called Impact HTA, which was focusing on orphan medicines. And that's a really challenging area for assessing value in health technology assessment. And I wondered, could you tell us a bit about what you did on that project and a little of what you learned about making decisions about the value of those medicines?
Absolutely. So this was a European Commission funded project, and I did it in a part-time post at the University of Edinburgh here in Scotland. And it ran from 2018 to 2021, and the report's on the web, so I'll share them in the chat later. But this was a project where I co-led the work package with a range of other scientists. I love interdisciplinary working, and I could see that rare diseases are hugely complex, and I didn't want this to be just about the economics. I wanted it to be about value and wider issues. So I worked with health services researchers and a couple of great economists, the wonderful Mike Drummond, who's the sort of father of HTA, but I also worked with a behavioral psychologist and a social anthropologist and a commissioner of rare disease services in England. So somebody who'd been at the front line of the health system. And what we did first was we wanted to understand whether rare disease treatments were evaluated differently. So were the equivalents of the bodies like PBAC working differently with rare disease treatments? And in the EU, we have something called an orphan medicinal product. That is a product that's designated by the regulator as being for a rare disease of, with a prevalence of less than 1 in 2,000 and likely to have a significant benefit. And in some countries, if a product had that orphan medicinal product definition, it was treated differently. It might skip the appraisal process completely and get immediate reimbursement. So that was the case in Germany and one of the smaller Central and Eastern European countries. In other countries, like in England, if it was an ultra rare condition, it might go down a completely different appraisal process and have different decision-making criteria. In others, it said, well, we might just modify our standard decision-making process. We might have a modifier which says we're a little bit more flexible. So if we think value for money is at, say, £30,000 for a quality adjusted life year, we might flex that up to £50,000 if it's a rare disease treatment. So a range of things were happening. And we documented all of that. So we documented standard appraisal processes and the special processes. But we wanted to delve into this more deeply because what we all know is a process can be stated, but the way a decision made is often more nuanced. And so we observed 3 different committees. We observed NICE in England, the Scottish Medicines Consortium in Scotland, and CADETH in Canada. And we looked at the whole process for a medicine. We looked at the information that was submitted by pharmaceutical companies, by clinical experts, by patient experts, if that was allowed, and by patient groups. We looked at how that was appraised by academics or assessed by academics. And then when it came to the decision-making table, we looked at whether patients and clinicians were involved at the committee table, if their views were taken account of, how those patient group submissions were considered, and whether there had been any pre-meetings with patients or clinical experts. So we looked at the whole process. We observed those meetings, and observing a meeting with a social anthropologist is really interesting because they're the kind of people that would look at like whether Fleur's smiling now or not, and really look at the nuance of whether, for example, a patient expert is really being listened to and what the body language is and how the dynamics work across the committee. So that was really fascinating to evaluate. We documented all of that for about 10 different products, looking at cell and gene therapy, but also treatments for rare metabolic conditions, cystic fibrosis. And our And we then interviewed the people who we'd seen at the committee table. So some of the decision makers, but some of the people who'd provided input, to understand whether they felt that they were being listened to, that they understood how the committee work was progressing. And what this gave us many insights, but what it led us to recommend was that really for rare diseases, we need a committee to understand the feasibility of what's possible. So often there's a critique of the clinical evidence that's put forward, but there's no understanding of the fact that this is such a rare condition that a better trial can't be undertaken and the best has been done. And then we saw that patient groups had made excellent submissions. Often, for example, cystic fibrosis, we have a great registry that's run jointly by the patient group and the clinicians. And it was sort of presented as almost being anecdote from the patient group, whereas it had come from really good, robust data from a UK registry, and it was almost skipped over. So a real important insight there that patient groups need to think about how they can collect good information and show it's good information. And HTA bodies need to recognize that. And that's something that HTA bodies really need to work on. And then what we did was we created an appraisal framework that's suitable for rare diseases. We said this needs to go beyond clinical and cost effectiveness. For many rare diseases, particularly the cell and gene therapies, this needs to think about organizational issues. We know that often treatments are given in specialized centers, even not just for cell and gene therapies, but for amyloidosis, for example, the national center is in London for people who live in Scotland. So there's a whole issue about how you get the treatment. And that's a particular issue if it's a childhood genetic disease where other members of the family may have illnesses that are keeping them at home. We actually need to start thinking about those things when we start offering a service. That needs to be considered. And a key recommendation we made was that whoever is appraising these conditions, whether it's a general appraisal committee or if it's a specialized, you need specialists in rare diseases, a pediatric specialist, an adult specialist, and a patient representative who's a specialist as well. So we need specialists on these committees because the issues are different. So that was a sort of overview of our recommendations there, and I'll put a link in the chat to give you some more information about that.
Thank you, Karen, and absolutely cruel to all of you tonight to ask you to condense these huge projects into a few minutes, but I know it will give people a taste of what's there. And Karen, you said something I wanted to pick up there. You know, I really heard this point about, you know, sometimes patient communities have really good registries, but they actually need to be able to communicate the strength of that work to HTA committees, because there may be, you know, a sort of a prejudice in people's minds where they assume something about the quality without knowing that. You saw a lot of these committee discussions. It must have been fascinating. I'm interested to know, did you get insights into the sort of patient input that was illuminating for committee members, or did you see, I know we've talked about lots of sort of generic ways of doing evidence for years, but what did you see?
Well, I think the other thing that's important to recognize within the world of health technology assessment is we're very traditional. We come from a so-called evidence-based background, evidence-based medicines background. And for us, the PICO is essential. So we start with population intervention comparator outcome. And so the first thing, if we think about comparator, that a patient group can tell us about is what the actual care pathway is in your own country, because we need to understand what treatments are actually given, how they're accessed, and how well they work. So that's a really, really important part of the evidence base. And often patient groups think they've got to focus on experience with the new treatment. And sometimes, particularly in places like Scotland, we don't have any patients who've actually had the treatment. but actually recognizing that you have huge value to give in terms of giving an honest view of the current care pathway is incredibly valuable. It sets that baseline for comparison. Then the way health technology assessment works is it works on this population. So who is it that will be eligible for this treatment? And if you can focus your input on that so-called population, that makes a huge difference. So rather than making a general statement about, this is what it's like to live with, for example, amyloidosis or with cystic fibrosis, if you can identify the population, so people with this particular genetic type or with this stage of disease for which the treatment will be used, if you can be specific, that's often much more helpful. And that's something you might want to think about in your surveys. I say to people, think about the populations that might be treated so you can differentiate them. If you've done a survey, you can pull out relevant patients. And one of the other things that was really, really striking for me was whenever anybody talked about the genetic implications of a condition. And I think that many of you live with this, that you don't think to explain the burden of it clearly. And for most of us, it hit us right in the heart when you start talking about other family members that are affected, whether it's aunts and uncles, and you've seen them go through something and you realize you're entering the end of a journey that you've seen your loved ones go through. When you have children, and that might affect several children, and the implications of that, and that's become more to the fore with some of the childhood genetic conditions we've seen. But I actually think, we've also called for psychological assessments within our work, and it's an area of research I'd like to take forward, is how do we communicate the psychological impacts of some of this and start measuring this. And then a final good example, absolutely mind-blowing example from a cystic fibrosis patient, where just for about every 20-minute period in the day, they explained what they had to do to keep a balance on their condition. So get up at 7:30, nebulize for 20 minutes, take this treatment, go back to nebulizing, have breakfast, manage diabetes, take this treatment, take that treatment, and a list of about 40 things that are done daily. That was actually really, really impactful and put up as a separate slide in one of the meetings we were at. And I think that asking people to document that is so much clearer. So thinking about, explain what the impacts are for you. And a one don't do not say this is a step change in treatment. The committee will decide whether it's innovative, but they hear that from every patient group. And from every patient group, unfortunately, they hear emotion. And they hear the same emotion. And you may think it's hard-hearted, but every patient group is saying, this is a step change, we must have this treatment, we want this treatment option. So that doesn't give any sway, but give as much information you can about what it's really like to live with a condition. And if you have it, the difference this treatment is making for cystic fibrosis, an average of 4% increase in forced expiratory volume doesn't mean much. But the doctor there who's saying, I'm 30, I have been able to return to my job as a full-time consultant in the hospital. I could not do this 6 months ago without this treatment. The young woman who is able to think about pregnancy, change life decisions. These are what we need to think about. So I'm passionate that we can do this better. And I know that Fleur has many more great examples of what patient groups can do as well.
Oh, thank you, Karen. When you speak, I'm thinking of an image you introduced into health technology assessment many years ago. Health technology assessment is sort of described as this bridge between evidence and policy. And Karen illustrated the involvement of patient communities with lights over the bridge, because you were saying that, you know, patient involvement illuminates this, and that's why you're not being hard saying, you know, don't say it's a step change, or because it's how patient knowledge, and there's so much knowledge in patients, and it's hard sometimes for them to know what out of all their knowledge is relevant here. And you've given us such guidance there. But it's that ability to turn the lights on to really help people to understand that step change, if that's what you want to do. There's a lot in what you've covered there, and I'm just going to remind people that, you know, we'd love you to jot down any questions in the chat box, and also if there's something you're going to take away from this session and you think we should remember it as a takeaway point, please pop it in the chat. And we'll take those takeaway points so that we can progress this conversation. But what I've heard from your experience, Karen, is that if you want to improve the understanding of the value of these medicines and potentially increase patient access to them, there are probably 3 areas to think about it. It could be the policy that establishes pathways that reflect the evidence challenges, or it could be these modifiers you mentioned, so that when the HTA committee is deliberating about the assessment, they take account of those additional factors. Or it could be the evidence, including how patients can show the value of a product to daily life, or show what their pathway is. But there's also this evidence base itself, which is part of the assessment, and it's what the company in Australia will have submitted. And so I want to bring Fleur in here now, because Fleur, my understanding is that through an initiative called Project Hercules, you're trying to actually improve that evidence base. Can you tell us about this work?
Yes, of course. And just to say that Karen's been very involved in the project as well. So it's really great to have her here so you can pick me up on anything that I miss. So as I spoke before about having professional and then personal involvement, I'm sort of really speaking here on behalf of Duchenne UK, a patient organisation of which I'm a member rather than my my day job. But essentially, as you've sort of talked about before, when it comes to health technology assessment, that's around sort of articulating the value of the product. And in my usual professional life, this is generally pretty easy. Well, it's not easy, but you know. And what you have to do is provide the evidence base to bodies like PBAC or NICE or CADIS or whoever. And what that involves is things including like an understanding of the treatment pathways, as Karen mentioned, systematic reviews of the evidence. You have to provide comparator treatment efficacy and effectiveness. You have to provide quality of life data in a specific format, which is called utility data. You have to show the impact on the healthcare system, data on the burden of illness, anything else that you can think to try and fill all those gaps. All of that is put into an economic model. And then that all needs to be published and provided. So that's quite a big undertaking for any disease, but there are real challenges in rare disease, mostly because the evidence base is sparse, but also because it can be quite splintered across the globe, and also inaccessible. So it can be quite hard to get hold of the evidence that you need. Running clinical trials in rare disease is also very difficult because you don't get many patients. The diseases can be quite heterogeneous. And then if you start talking about paediatric trials, that's a whole other difficulty in terms of getting the evidence that's necessary. So I was looking at this trying to do it from an objective point of view, as Karen says. I've been trying not to bring too much emotion into the field, but evidence is where we're coming from. So what we did via Duchenne UK, which is a patient organisation, is start to say, well, can we create an evidence base that we need for health technology assessment for Duchenne? And can we do that in a collaborative way? Because that's the way that we will be able to spread the cost and generate something which is useful. Also trying to lead it from a patient perspective. So what, again, as Karen was saying, like what's really important to the patient, how do we bring that into the evidence base? So what we did was initially set up a very small consortium to say, can we create an economic model that everybody can use when it comes to health technology assessment in Duchenne? It did multiply somewhat after that, because you can't write an economic model unless you have a natural history of the disease, which there wasn't. Well, there was, but it wasn't particularly articulate and didn't actually represent what's happening to patients. So we had to create a natural history model of the disease. You also need the quality of life measures within that. Again, we sort of looked at what's been used so far in Duchenne. Is it actually reasonable? Is it reflecting the patient experience? Concluded that it wasn't. So therefore set up a whole new quality of life metric for Duchenne, which we think we could now probably apply into other similar paediatric diseases. We then realised that the burden of the disease wasn't well described, and particularly not on the broader family, as again, as Karen's alluded to, like the impact of rare disease, particularly in paediatrics, impacts far beyond the individual, as it may just do in a disease such as asthma in an adult, for example. And then we also needed to understand the impact of current treatments. So there's a lot of steroid use in Duchenne, which has big implications on a growing paediatric population. So we set off on this journey, just sort of thinking, well, maybe we can just make this economic model and people can use it and we'll drive it from the patient perspective. But this morphed into a project where the pharma companies could really see the value of it. So we've got 10 pharma companies involved in the project, patient organisations from across the globe, clinicians and decision makers. And what we're doing is setting up, or what we have done is set up a group where we have collated this evidence and pulled it together into a disease level evidence base that then all of the pharma companies can use when it comes to HTA. And there's a number of benefits to that. I mean, from a personal perspective, as a patient, because there were a number of companies in this space, we were getting asked the same questions over and over again. And from a health economist point of view, at best, that's duplicative. And at worst, it could be conflicting evidence. And then from a patient perspective, it's tiring. You don't want to be asked these questions all the time. You haven't got time for it. But everyone's willing to do it because they think it's going to sort of improve things. So it's really about sort of also reducing the burden on the patient population in terms of what they're being requested for. And then the benefits to agencies such as NICE or TBAC or CADITH is that when they do get their health technology assessment submissions from industry, they know that the evidence base that they're presenting is the gold standard best that they could possibly have. So we've pulled together data from across the globe to create the national history model. The economic model has been written by an expert group and verified by academics. So it's probably the best that you would be able to achieve. And the quality of life metric is now available on a platform for anyone to use and put into their clinical trials, and again validated by experts at the University of Sheffield, who are the leading experts in utility data. So that's where we've got to. It's been a bit of a journey, and what we've tried to do is really ensure that it's the patient that's leading all of this, but with the sort of professional and academic expertise and support behind it to make it really credible, so that when we do go to HTA bodies, they know that it's gold standard and that the patient has been integral in driving that through.
Oh, Fleur, I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call who feels both weary at the thought of the enormous amount of work to take you to where you are now, but energized to think what this means about, being able to show the value of a treatment. And what I was wondering is, this is wonderful for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community. Is there something there that other people can benefit from what you've done?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think we've always said we've sort of operated without a blueprint, but now we've essentially made a blueprint. I think there was probably a bit of a perfect storm at the time, i.e. there were a number of companies with different medicines in development and not all competing in the same space. So Duchenne's hits every organ in the body. So there's treatments for the cardiac side of things, respiratory side of things, as well as the muscular impact. So you've got companies who have sort of slightly different angles coming at it as well. And also the sort of perfect storm of me being in that position where I could use my professional insight into what we might need to do in this space. But what it does do is show that companies and academics and decision makers and clinicians and patients, more importantly, can all work together to provide something like this. So this is easily translatable into other areas. Some of the things that we have done are probably directly useful. So things like the DMD qual, which is the quality of life measure, would likely be suitable for most paediatric progressive conditions. So that's something that we could look at using. It would be more suitable probably than the generic EQ5Ds and other standard quality of life measures, particularly, like I say, in these paediatric progressive conditions. One of the things that we're also doing at this moment is starting to look at carer and parent quality of life and burden. And as a parent in the rare disease community, and I have many friends with children with many other similar conditions, I think you can see that the burden and impact on us is all quite similar. So regardless of the etiology of your disease or the speed of it, even, the impacts are probably the same in terms of things like anticipatory grief, managing your other children and your family, whether you can return to work or not, the impacts on daily living, and I think you mentioned that someone here couldn't attend because their child was on a clinical trial and then they couldn't get childcare for the other child. Those sorts of things are they're going to be fairly common across diseases like this. So I think the work that we're doing in the caregiver space will also be useful and impactful across other conditions.
Yeah, it's interesting because I often think I had the pleasure of attending the Rare Voices Rare Summit last year and learning so much from many of you who are on this call tonight. And I thought, oh gosh, for so many people, these experiences are common, but for those of us who haven't had that experience, we're just ignorant of it. So the fact that you would have to tell things again and again to different researchers and that it could be sitting there within common tools, I think is exciting. I can see there's a question here for Karen and Fleur, which was, what impact have you seen from the Project Hercules on HTA decision making? Is it too soon to see impact, or have you seen impact already?
Yes, well, we have seen impact already. I mean, one of the frustrating things with Duchenne is that the treatments seem to sort of come along and then not actually reach the point where they actually need HTA. But we have recently, the first one has now used the Hercules model and gone into HTA in NICE. So it is working and it has really smoothed the way for that decision. So I'd probably bow to Karen in terms of whether she's seen any other impacts.
Yeah, I think the impacts are multiple and we shouldn't just think about the decisions. So I think what I've seen is industry change what they're doing in clinical development. And that's the most important thing to think about, for using that model, and that whole process is really important. But I want to also go back a stage. That I think a really important thing that happened in Project Hercules was an aligning of stakeholders' understanding of issues. So I think, and I may be disrespectful here, that the academics came into that room thinking, I've got a grant, I'm going to develop a new PRO. They were faced with 3 amazing chairs of people who have incredible experience of caring for children. And the things that were being said just stopped them in their tracks. So those academics had never had that kind of interaction with patients and their carers on an ongoing basis. So it really came a co-production effort. And I've said to Fleur before that for me, that as a sort of almost observer, that's been an amazing thing to see, where academics have totally changed the way they're working from, oh, we've got to kind of consult with these patient groups, to, oh my goodness, they have really important things to say. I need to change the way I'm thinking. I need to think about how I'm presenting complex information to them so I can get their input, because they're going to improve what I do. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to get a really good publication out of it as well. So that's being a little bit cynical, but I think it's a real added benefit of this academic collaboration. And we need to kind of think about industry, but we need to think about academic collaboration as well.
Oh, thank you, Karen. That's really interesting, because we often talk about, how can we change health technology assessment, but it's a whole ecosystem we're talking about here, and a whole way that we understand knowledge. Now, I'm dying to bring Nicole Millis in, who's been sitting there patiently. Nicole,
it's been a long time for me to wait, and those that know me know how much
I have. You probably thought we forgot you, but I didn't, because we've heard a lot tonight, and I'd really love to hear some of your thoughts about the implications for Australia from what we've heard.
Yeah, sure. Look, and I think some of the things that have already been said are really striking a chord, and in particular, Karen, when you were talking about shining a light on HTA, the patient perspective. Certainly in the Australian context, we have seen in the rare disease space where what we call in RVA, we call it that what the consumer voice can do, or consumer perspective can do, is add the narrative behind the data to explain the data, which, as has been said, is often not always terrific or robust or strong data, or it's data, but it's hard to, it often hides, I think, the true value, because of the things that have been mentioned in terms of heterogeneity, and also sometimes the measures or that the data is about are perhaps not quite the most telling measures, for a whole range of reasons that have been discussed. But it's wonderful to hear all these big projects around big systemic solutions. I guess I also wanted to bring in another perspective, though, because I think, I think for patient group leaders, it can seem sometimes a bit overwhelming, that you think, oh my gosh, now we have to recreate something, so there's this huge project and get everyone working together to make a change. I've seen, certainly within the Australian context, that there are parts of the processes already where the consumer voice, it's embedded within the system. There are processes like stakeholder meetings, consumer hearings, and for rare disease, those have been quite mind-changing for committees. And it often comes down to, and I very much agree with what's already been said, in terms of, I think what is often most helpful for committees is not saying that, we should have this disease, or that they have, so we should have this treatment, they have this treatment overseas. I'm not sure that that's a particularly compelling argument, but what is compelling is when you talk about that there's an increase in meters that can be walked. And again, when committees might look at that, they might say, oh, but what does that mean? What does it matter that there's so many more meters? But what I've seen is that when patients and families come in and they talk about their families and what that actually means, and that means that their child, for instance, can play with their friends at school at lunchtime. It means they can walk down the street and visit grandma, and there's all those quality of life. And I think one of the often in my line of work, we talk a lot about the gaps in the Australian HTA system. And I think one of the strengths to hold on to is that in Australia, and I'm sure this is the case in a number of HTA systems around the world, as an individual, you can have your say. And that's really quite powerful, particularly in rare disease, where there may not even be a support group, or that there may, you don't have to rely on big organisations or bigger, well-sustained patient groups. You can actually just share your story, and that can be really quite powerful. We always say at RVA, we encourage all patient group leaders, all people wanting to engage in HTA, to actually to spend some time and find out about the systems and around the questions and around the answers that they're seeking. HTA, in my very 101 dumbed down explanation of what HTA is, I said it's about managing uncertainty. That's the whole process of HTA. That gets to the level of uncertainty where the government or the payer and everyone is happy. And of course, in rare disease, we know that the biggest theme in rare disease is uncertainty. So there's that real disconnect from the start. And we need to be, I think, from patient groups, be a bit more tuned in terms of what data or what evidence or what questions the committee are trying to get answers to, and how can we shape our evidence more towards that. And it surveys and registries are wonderful, but I also want to say to people, don't be too overwhelmed. I have seen a HTA decision being completely reversed on 2 families giving their stories around why it makes a difference that a patient can walk more. So, I just wanted to sort of to say that. And I guess the other eliminating thing for me, I think, before I was involved in HTA, I often thought, gee, the decision makers are heartless, or how can they make such a decision? And it's been really, over the years, and then getting to know those decision makers, I know that they are very empathetic and sympathetic people. What I think the disconnect is often the evidence and data, or the input that's provided, doesn't match up or align well enough with the answers that they need to answer, or the uncertainties that they need to manage. So I think it's really important that we go in, we acknowledge that there's uncertainties, but make sure as a patient group leader, you have a really good understanding of what those specific uncertainties are for your group. Yes, have a good relationship with the companies and be very aware about what data they're putting in as much as you can, because I'm sure that there will be gaps, and you will be asked to fill those gaps. So it just, I just wanted to add that, because HTA is, it can seem really overwhelming to people.
I think that's a wonderful point you brought in there, Nicole, because, when we're trying to think about what HTA can be and what the evidence base can be, we don't want to lose sight of the opportunity that's there at the moment. And I certainly don't want tonight's discussion to overwhelm people, because it is huge what's being done by Project Hercules. And I think there's other things for us to learn from it and to benefit from that work. And we can't solve the problem of valuing technologies all with one genius solution. It's not that simple. And tonight some of the discussion is showing, it's showing there's a policy area, there's an area around what the process is and how it takes on modifiers. There's an area around how we build this evidence to better reflect patients' views. And you've really articulated so clearly there, because about what individual patient and what patient community or group input can be. And it worries me sometimes that we talk about these things as if it's an either or. They're and you describe so well there this search to reduce uncertainty, which is why we add this pathway, and we have these modifiers, and we try to have it illuminated with patient stories so we can see what this thing is we're really talking about. So thank you for bringing that in. I'm going to quickly go to a question I've seen over here. I'm watching the time. Anna has said, how are you measuring the burden of families, parents? Surveys, observations? What measures are you using? Fleur, will I put that one across to you?
Yeah, of course. I think there's sort of two aspects to burden that need to be explored. One is around the sort of the actual burden of the disease, and the others around the quality of life impact, and they're sort of two slightly separate things. So the burden is, you can quantify that in several ways, but usually within burden of illness studies, and that is around exactly as you say, surveying patients and their families, asking what impacts they've had, whether it's financial, whether it's number of visits to a hospital, all of those types of things. So you can put all that into one study. You can look at databases, so where there are databases where you can identify the condition, and then you can look at the number of healthcare interactions within that. So you can look at whether how many prescriptions you've had, how many visits you've had, what whether you've had like a wheelchair prescribed, those sorts of things. So you can do it in that way. And then the final one is around the sort of quality of life piece, and that would be around direct questionnaires asked to the individuals, but that's sort of very much a work in progress, I would say.
That sounds like something we can keep an eye on there. Thank you, Fleur. Now, we only really have a minute or two, and I wonder, can I go back to each of our guests? And just because we haven't had anyone boldly contribute their takeaway, although there are some people who are really enjoying the conversation, I can see, and reflecting on all sorts of, you know, little insights that were there amongst all this information we heard tonight. But I wonder whether I can ask our guests if you would share with us something you think we should take away for this discussion as we think about health technology assessment in Australia. Who will I pick on first? Karen, will I pick on you first because you've got Scotland in the background and I'm just drawn to your picture there.
Well, I think I'm going to reflect on what Nicole has said, particularly the phrase of uncertainties. And it is something that we identified clearly in our research, but I didn't talk about, was that stakeholder input, both patients and clinicians, and I think we could talk about how we work with clinicians, have great value and can help resolve uncertainties. But to do that optimally, the HTA process may need to change a little bit. So, for example, what we saw at NICE was the night before the committee, the committee and the stakeholders who were coming along into the meeting the next day were given a set of slides which identified what the key issues were. So they had overnight to go away and think, have I got any information about carer burden or long-term effects or the impact of this particular side effect? And actually that was not good enough. That was not good enough. So sometimes we may need to lengthen our processes a little bit to enable good stakeholder involvement so that we have time and opportunity to ask our communities for information about this. And I think that just for two key takeaways, picking up on what Fleur said there, that I think this whole area of carer and family impacts is a burgeoning area of research. We should be encouraging our academic units to be investing in this. It's a complete mess what's done at NICE at the moment. We've done a sort of little review about what's done, and it's not consistent. It's not consistent about whether it's adult carers or children carers or life-limiting conditions. It's a very much a sticking plaster approach. So let's encourage research in this. So two key takeaways there. Let's think about if we can encourage some process changes to enable our better participation, to be able to present that information, to provide the illumination. And let's think about how we work with academics and improve those partnerships.
Oh, thank you, Karen. And Fleur, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting discussion. And one of the things that I would strongly sort of take away from this is around what we're trying to do is articulate the patient voice, but in a way that a decision maker will understand. That's what we're really trying to do. And you can only do that by listening to the patient and then translating it into that language. And I think the other piece that has really come out is around bringing everybody on that journey with you. It's like people haven't thought about all of these things. And if they haven't thought about these things, they need to know that they're important. So it's all around sort of amplifying and articulating that patient voice for me.
Oh, great comments. Thank you. And Nicole?
Look, I think I just obviously wanted to echo what Karen said around increasing stakeholder involvement. I'm going to disagree with part of it. I don't know. I know lots of people will have issue with the phrase, let's lengthen the process to do that. I think instead, let's look for opportunities early in the process and not just, way much earlier in the process so we can start identifying that consumer expertise. I guess similarly, traditionally in Australia, there's, there are, as I said, times where they bring in consumer input, but it's traditionally quite late in the process. And so that's why, I think there's certainly some moves now to change HTA in Australia and around bringing an enhanced consumer process earlier in the system. I think what would also help is that the system recognises the expertise that consumers bring, not just in providing input, but also identifying the uncertainties really early on in the process, and even before HTA in the clinical trial development, and setting the right measures that will then make sense for the HTA process. So that's what I would encourage, I guess, the whole system to say, is that there's consumer expertise that can provide identification of the uncertainties, but also identify potential ways that we can resolve uncertainties. So if we had that discussion with all the right people in the room early on in the process, and then continuing on at key parts of the process, I think we can have a much enhanced stakeholder process without adding any time and potentially reducing time, because one of the ways HTA systems handles uncertainty is and we know this, we see this all the time in rare disease context, that there are submission and then a resubmission and another resubmission. That is quite common in the rare disease space, and that at the heart of it is really about reducing uncertainty, so that we have to go again and get more evidence. If we can identify, the system is strong enough to identify some of those uncertainties and potential solutions early on, and use everybody's expertise, bring the industry, bring clinicians, bring the patients together at that point, it gives us the most time to resolve those issues without adding real time, which we know in the rare disease context is devastating or can be devastating.
I would love to continue this conversation. I knew it was ridiculous to try and squeeze it in an hour, so I didn't. I've run 4 minutes late, and I do apologise for keeping you, especially to some of our guests who are ducking in and out of other events over in the UK today. So I apologise for doing that, but I found the conversation incredibly useful. Lots to take forward. I want to just do a couple of thank yous. Firstly, thank you, Karen, Fleur and Nicole. Really appreciate you joining us for this conversation tonight. I've got an enormous amount out of it, and I hope the rest of the audience has too. Thank you, Veronica, who stepped in to run the technical side this evening. Really appreciate it. I need to do a quick plug, and it pains me to do this, but in Adelaide on the 24th of June, HTAI Adelaide, Health Technology International Adelaide, will kick off on that day, there's one really wonderful workshop going on that I will be running, but Karen Facey is running a rare disease workshop there. Now, some of you, I think, already know about this, but I really recommend it. Even if you can't attend for the whole conference, I think, you know, you will get a lot out of this day, and I know you'll bring a lot to the day as well. So the other thing I'm going to quickly mention is for Australian patients, we will announce a grant system next week through Patient Voice Initiative. We hope to get 15 to 20 patients to that conference through grants. And if you're overseas and you're a patient or a patient representative, the HTAI Patient and Citizen Interest Group will also announce its grant process next week as well. So do keep it in mind. The Rare Disease Workshop will be terrific. The whole annual meeting will be. And if you don't want to go to Karen's workshop, you can come to mine instead, which is the Patient and Citizen Involvement one. So thank you all for tonight. Really appreciate it. Thank you again to our speakers.